Hey, Kristen. Good morning to you, Barbara. And God bless you too. I'm going to read some scripture from Ephesians 4 today to start us off. Let's see. So Ephesians 4 just reminds me of some of the stuff we're talking about. So verse 25 is where I'm going to start. Ephesians 4:25. Therefore, rejecting all falsehood, whether lying, defrauding, telling half-truths, spreading rumors, any such as these, speak truth, each one with his neighbor. For we are all parts of one another, and we are all parts of the body of Christ. So this verse had made me think about how we were talking about yesterday when we see abuse happening, right? Even just the most subtle stuff, right? If we speak truth to one another and we're like, in love, hey, I noticed that wasn't a very healthy way to deal with something. Or I see this is happening. We're calling out the truth in love. And the reason for that is because we don't want it to progress, right? So we're helping one another when we share that truth, and we're not ignoring it and enabling others to just continue to grow in abusive ways. And that's why truth is important. So be angry at sin, at immorality, at injustice, at ungodly behavior, right? And abuse is definitely ungodly. So be angry, yet do not sin. Do not let your anger cause you shame, nor allow it to last until the sun goes down. So especially when we've been through abusive situations, we can definitely get angry, right? But we don't want that anger to grow within us to where we become abusers, right? But we don't want that anger to grow within us to where we become abusers, right? So we want to deal with the things that have happened so that we can be set free from that anger. So we want to deal with the things that have happened so that we can be set free from that anger, from that injustice, from the sadness, from the pain that we've experienced. And do not give the devil an opportunity to lead you into sin by holding a grudge or nurturing anger or harboring resentment or cultivating bitterness. So God is telling us, if you are going to hold on to a grudge, if you're going to nurture that anger and that injustice and the pain, then you are giving the devil an opportunity to really grow, right? His character to grow within you. You're giving him a foothold into your life. And we don't want to do that, right? So we want to deal with the things that have happened in our lives so that we can live a life of peace and we can treat others like God wants us to treat them, right? And not act out of our pain. So that was some of the, when I was reading this the other day, kind of caught my attention. Just so you know, I'm using the AMP version amplified, so there is extra stuff added into that. They put it in brackets to help you to understand the scripture better. So I've been using this a lot for the past year or two. And so far it's been really good. I haven't noticed anything that wasn't I haven't noticed any discrepancies within it. So that is why there's some extra stuff possibly than what you've read in your versions. Okay. So I'm gonna pray, and then we can get into finishing probably this chapter that we're on in the book. Lord, I just ask you again for your presence today, for you to speak through me, give me the words that need to be heard. I ask you to open all of our hearts to trusting you, especially if we are going through a healing process, Lord. Help us to stand firm with you, knowing that no matter what it feels like in the moment of what we're going through, healing can be confusing and painful and scary, and just help us to not act out of those feelings, but to remain with you, knowing that you'll get us through it. I ask you to highlight the things that we need to see, prompt us to maybe put some more thought and research into what we need to be able to be set free. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So I don't forget, Kristen, you had asked about products for like anxiety and stuff. So this is the one I was telling you about. I don't know if it's Gaia or Jaya herbs. So Calm Restore is the one that I use. I don't use it daily. I use it like when I'm really anxious. But it has skullcap, passion flower, chamomile. Actually, maybe it doesn't even have lavender. I thought it did. But this is the one I use. When I Googled it this morning, it did come up on some sites, but you have to look better, because I know one of them was like, if you were, like a doctor's office, you could get it, right? So it's like in bulk, but I did go on their actual website. I could not find that one specifically, but they do have one called like Calm ASAP. I know ashwagandha is another one that's supposed to be able to help calm you. And then I just have passion flower extract. I will just put like a dropper or two inside drinks. It has a very earthy flavor to it, but if you're putting it in, a big drink, you're not really going to notice it. So yeah, those are the two things that I use when I really need some extra help in calming down. So let's see. So we're going over profiles of abusers, okay? Even if you haven't been through abuse and you don't need healing, this is great stuff to know, so that if God brings anybody into your life, right, that's going through stuff and he wants you to help them, you have some knowledge in that, right? All right, so we had learned you do not know. Sorry, I'm thinking my brain's not functioning properly. You do not know an abuser by the way they look, right? They come from all walks of life. Any of us could be an abuser. So the ways we can know, right? It's basically like the red flags, right? So more than likely, unless it's through discernment, you're not going to know right when you meet somebody whether they're abusive or not. So it's going to be a thing that you'll notice over time, right? So red flags. So one of them is denying all responsibility. So they do not want to be accountable for anything that they may do wrong. And then if there's like hardcore proof that they did something wrong, they may take partial ownership over it, but then they resort to blame shifting, right? So they're going to share the blame. But they don't want to take it fully, which is what we're called to do, right? God's like, own your stuff, let me free you from the guilt, and let's do new, right? Let's be new. The second one was bold deceitfulness. So abusers can be masterful at manipulating words and actions to confuse, confound, and put others on the defense. And then when I've been in a lot of these situations, right, you never argue with somebody who's acting in abusive ways, because it has always been twisted then for me in my situations. Get into this argument, they're really good at twisting things and putting it back on you, and then there's all this confusion and absolutely nothing gets settled, and I usually walked away thinking that I was crazy. So that is another way that you can tell that somebody is being abusive. Covering up their tracks. We had learned from the story with David and Bathsheba, how he kept trying to take care of that situation so he wouldn't get caught. So he had tried to cover his tracks. When Bathsheba's husband was not complying to where he was able to cover his tracks, he ended up having him killed, right? So he got rid of the problem, yet he's still accountable to God, so it didn't fix everything, right? And then now we're on to today. So harsh judgmentalism is the next one that this author brings up. It is Mending the Soul by Stephen R. Tracy. All right, so harsh judgmentalism. In spite of and even because of their own destructive behavior, abusers are often very judgmental and harsh towards others. This allows them to maintain the high moral ground and deflect attention from themselves onto others. To do so is often an effective way of maintaining their moral facade, thus it perpetuates their denial of responsibility. This harsh judgmentalism is also a godless method for unrepentant abusers to deal with their own shame. So, wow, that's like, okay, so like I've talked about false or toxic shame in the past, right? That is not our guilt, it's not our shame, right, to carry, but we've taken it on. So this would be one way how we take that on, because they will actually try to put it on you because they don't want to feel it. They're trying to get rid of it, right? So I believe in seeing this happen over the years, it's like they start to really believe, right? So it might start out as they know what they're doing, they're lying, they are accountable, right? But as they continue to go through this process, why it's important for us to call this out in each other is they start to actually believe that they're right and that you're having issues, right? And so they're able to then actually feel like they're shifting that shame where it needs to go, when in fact it needs to stay with them. And it has stayed, but because they're so good, right, we're good at putting those walls up and stuffing things, it's like it's not there. So instead of facing their shame, much of which is a gracious, God-given internal witness to their sin, they displace it onto others. Abusers often become quite sophisticated at this technique, for it is generally developed over long periods of time. So because the offender is still minimizing his guilt, he will desperately try to maintain secrecy through verbal taunts and accusations that will sidetrack all meaningful discussion. And that has happened a lot to me in the past when I have been on my healing journey, right? And I wanted to start talking about the family dysfunction. there have been a lot of times where I will try to do that. I'll bring things up and then it ends up back on me. Because things that I do wrong, like one thing that I still struggle with is vaping, right? So although I've done all this work, right, and I am on a really good path with God now, I am a different person. I am a lot healthier. I've done so much work. I can bring up something about somebody else in like the family, right? And then vaping will come up. And because that's the one thing that people still have that they can point out about me, right? And so that is them trying to shift that onto me, that focus onto me, and get me to shut up, right? Because then I'm like, oh, I'm a bad person. I don't really get like that. Like I'm okay. Like vaping will be taken care of eventually, I'm sure. But yeah, that's the intention, to shift that focus. So thus he will remember the number of times, Thus he will remember the number of times the wife refused his demands for intimacy, the time she got intoxicated, or the time she didn't clean the house to his satisfaction, or forgot his birthday wishes, or left dirty socks on the floor. So anything they can grab, they will try to grab and toss at you to stop the conversation or the focus being on them. He'll remember the times the children fought, disturbed his sleep, came home late, did poorly in school, wasted their allowance, spilled milk during dinner. To each of these events, he will attach some value judgment that, although it may be absurd, again deflects the discussion away from the abuse that he is causing. Or she. The tendency of abusers to harshly judge others is well attested in Scripture. While King David was sleeping with the very woman he stole from his faithful servant, whose faithfulness he rewarded by murdering him, David expressed great outrage that a rich man would steal a lamb from a poor neighbor. In fact, David's moral outrage was so great that he said the rich man deserved to die. Even though stealing was never deemed a capital offense in the Torah, rather the Torah prescribed restitution for theft. On the other hand, murder, sexual abuse, and adultery with a married woman were all capital offenses at this time. Thus, David's response to the rich man who stole a sheep evidences an ironically harsh judgment from one who had committed and continued to cover up not one but multiple capital offenses. The intensity with which abusers maintain their hypocritical judgmentalism is often ferocious. The more counselors and family members try to confront an abuser's sin, the more aggressive he or she becomes in identifying and scrutinizing the sins, mistakes. Family members try to confront an abuser's sin, the more aggressive he or she becomes in identifying and scrutinizing the sins, mistakes, and weaknesses of others. He goes into a story, I don't know that I really want to read. All right, maybe we'll read some of this. Okay, so Sean grew up in an affluent religious home in the Deep South. As an adolescent, he took advantage of his prestige and wealth. He developed a callous disregard for women once he got what he wanted from them. In college, he started going to church again, as it afforded him ample opportunity to meet attractive and often naive young women. Sean began to date a shy woman named Beth, who had little social experience. Sean pressured Beth into having sex with him early in the relationship. Once this happened, his disrespect for Beth became palpable. He ridiculed her for not being able to meet his needs. He demanded she clean his house and do his laundry. He constantly joked about the anatomies of other women and accused Beth of sinful jealousy when she asked him to stop. She felt trapped and guilty about their sexual relationship and, against her better judgment, agreed to marry him. Once they got married, Sean's abusive behaviors intensified, as they always do, right? If you're being abused in your dating relationship, it's not going to get better if you get married. He repeatedly threatened Beth physically and put his fist through a wall in an effort to strike her. His escalating use of porn and his repeated online affairs caused him to make twisted, abusive, sexual demands of Beth. He raged at her for not being a godly wife, for not responding to his leadership by meeting his needs. Sean's verbal, physical, and spiritual abuse intensified. Eventually, after their third child was born, Beth decided she could no longer endure her abusive marriage. With the help of a Christian psychologist and a godly neighbor who was a retired medical missionary, Beth began to gain the strength to set appropriate boundaries around her husband's destructive behavior. She separated from Sean and insisted he get counseling. Sean wrote the following letter to Beth after she, her pastor, and the psychologist insisted Sean not contact her directly. I believe the reason you are so angry and bitter toward me is not because I was such a horrible person, but because you got into a relationship you didn't want to be in the first place. You felt pressured to get married, and you got married. That isn't my fault. If you actually loved me, a lot of the bitterness and resentment you have inside you would not be there. Love covers a multitude of sins. Beth, you did some pretty horrible things to me as well. So he's taking kind of ownership, right? Half. He's like, okay, I did some bad things, but you did a lot of bad things. 2, please don't forget that you called me every name in the book. You swore at me. You hit me dozens of times. You've withheld sex from me. You refuse to get close to me, and you leave every time life gets tough. I have done nothing a little forgiveness won't take care of. You refuse to help me overcome my sin. That is why I have fallen. Wow, he's literally blaming her for him falling at all, right? Because she refuses to help him overcome his sin. Clearly, Sean placed the blame for his marital problems squarely on Beth's shoulders. She was to blame for their problems, including his sexual sin. She was to blame for being bitter. In fact, his letter ends with a demand that she start being gracious and Christ-like. That's a good one. That's one that a lot of religious abusers will pull out is, would Jesus act like that? You know, you should be more like God. Sean offers a sad example of the harsh judgmentalism of abusers. Abusers' judgmentalism can greatly compound the damaging effects of the abuse. Abuse creates a shame that makes victims feel they are bad, worthless, defective, and responsible for the abuse. And then just that letter, right? There was so many shaming moments in that letter to add to what she already felt. In some cases, even the anticipation of abuse can launch this self-blaming dynamic. For instance, in 1 Kings 18:9, godly Obadiah thought he was about to be murdered by King Ahab. So he asked Elijah what sin he had committed that he was about to be abused. In reality, God has spoken through the prophet Elijah to declare he would send a severe drought on the land as judgment for Ahab's wickedness in leading the people into idolatry. That's interesting that he thought that the threat of being killed by King Ahab was because of a sin that he had committed, when it was just really King Ahab was evil, right? Like some people will think, I'm going through this because God's punishing me. And I have never seen that God would punish us. Yes, he disciplines us as children to get us back on track, but he does not punish us by bringing somebody into our lives who's going to abuse us. That is not how God works. He does not crush us to get us to listen, right? He loves us, and that's what makes us want to be walking with him, right? So, in reality, God had spoken through prophet Elijah to declare he would send a severe drought on the land as judgment for Ahab's wickedness in leading the people into idolatry. After several years of severe drought, when Ahab saw Elijah, the first words out of his mouth were, "Is this you, you troubler of Israel?" So then Ahab, instead of being accountable for his sin and abuse, he's trying to pin it also on Obadiah, right? We're talking about Obadiah. He's trying to pin it on him and blame shift, right? Instead of being accountable. So in fact, Ahab's harshness had no basis in reality. Ahab himself was the troubler of Israel. In this case, Elijah was mature enough not to accept Ahab's judgmental message. So that's good. That's the place we want to be in, right? We want to be so confident in who we are, in our character, in God, that we are not going to take what you're trying to give us, right? You keep your account, your shame. You keep it, because that's not mine. I didn't do anything to cause this. All right, so then the next one is calculated intimidation. Because abusers' lives are built around twisting reality, avoiding consequences, and engaging in behavior that brings temporary relief to their inner torment. So we had also talked about this, I think, yesterday, that it's impossible that people who are abusers are not suffering, or that they've done things wrong. They are suffering. It's just a natural thing that happens to us, is we have that guilt. We have that moral compass. We know we did something wrong. We don't feel good about what we did. So it's impossible to go about life doing things that are bad or negative and actually being happy, right? They typically cannot face the reality of their destructive actions. Most abusers are desperate to keep their victims from revealing the truth. Thus, they often strategize to intimidate their victims into silence and submission, which allows them to continue to abuse with impunity. This also creates further damage to the victims, for it adds to their emotional trauma and can intensify feelings of powerlessness and vulnerability. So a biblical example of intimidation. There are examples in the Bible that illustrate the various kinds of intimidation used by abusers. The most extreme is the direct promise of severe bodily harm, as seen in wicked Queen Jezebel's threat. So we've talked about Jezebel before, right? So people talk about the spirit of Jezebel. So that is like this Queen Jezebel in scripture, her character, right, is part of the enemy, right? And the enemy's character. So when people start to act out those things, that becomes stronger and stronger within us, that character, right? So then that spirit has access to operate and work through us because we're allowing it. So that's where that comes from, is Jezebel here. And narcissist is what the world calls the Jezebel character, right? The spirit of Jezebel, it is a narcissist. So Queen Jezebel's threat to have Elijah killed within 24 hours after he carried out divine judgment on the priests of Baal or Baal, I don't know how you say that. So this is in 1 Kings 19. Sadistic sex offenders are often to tell their victims ahead of time what horrible things they plan to do to them, as this kind of intimidation brings them pleasure. Now, I was thinking about this yesterday. I don't believe that everybody that's abusive really understands what they're doing, okay? Yes, I believe that there's definitely the possibility there are people who actually enjoy it, right? They enjoy abuse. Abusing people, right? But I think that there's a lot of us that just don't understand what it is, because if we're especially raised with it, that's just life, right? That's just how you function. And until you see different and you start to know different, that's just how you operate. And there's the generational sin patterns, curses. That's where all that comes from, because we're just repeating what we knew, right? So that's why, again, pointing out the truth is important. So sometimes opaque threats are just as traumatizing as direct threats, because they create a general sense of dread. And that's true, like a lot of my life, even in my grown adult relationships, because I ended up with a lot of abusive men, it was always like walking on eggshells, right? They didn't actually have to touch me. They didn't actually have to do anything, but I was walking on eggshells, because you never knew what could happen and how bad it could be. This is what King Ahab did with the prophet Micaiah when he put him in prison after the prophet gave a prophecy Ahab didn't want to hear. Before he left for battle, Ahab told Micaiah and the prison guards that Micaiah was only to be given a sparse diet of bread and water until I return, implying that a much worse fate would befall the prophet when the king came back victorious from battle. One of the most common types of intimidation used by abusers is the verbal threat of harm, unless they are given what they want. Man, really challenging me with these words today. Rabshakeh, general of an Assyrian army infamous for its sadistic cruelty, threatened extreme harm to the Judeans unless they gave in to him. This was an idle threat, for the Assyrians were well known for extreme cruelty to their enemies. Archaeologists have discovered various ancient texts in which the Assyrians, with great braggadocio, these words are killing me here, recount the utter destruction of cities they conquered. They graphically recorded how, after defending enemy armies, they would pile up the severed heads of enemy soldiers, slaughter the defeated citizens, torture the defeated royal family, flay political leaders, and place conquered women in the royal harem. So they were already known for all of this stuff, right? So like, they didn't actually have to perform this every single time, right? Because the fear was already there. So like, in like my relationships as an adult with men, I maybe got hit once or twice, right, in these relationships, but it was enough to keep me in line because I didn't want it to happen again, right? So that was enough. I didn't have to have it happen all the time for me to try to stay in line. The diabolical creativity of intimidation. The creativity of abusers to intimidate is quite diabolical, for it is often based on a serious calculation of the victim's weaknesses, points of vulnerability, and greatest fears. I've often heard sexual abuse victims say they passively endured their father's abuse as long as they did because the fathers threatened to do harm to younger siblings if they resisted. One 16-year-old serial physical and sexual abuser of adolescents told his young victims he would come back and kill their families if they told anyone what had been done. Furthermore, he told these naive young children that he could see and hear through the walls. So he would always know if they told anyone, and sadly, they believed him. Then there's the story about a Christian school principal who was convicted of child abuse for forcing a 15-year-old who was considering enrolling at the school to completely disrobe, bend over, and receive swats. At first, she refused to comply, but he threatened to give her 12 swats unless she immediately did it. He said he wanted her to understand corporal punishment before she attended the school. The girl, who had gotten in trouble at previous schools, was told she deserved the punishment. So say she's vulnerable. She's already gotten in trouble. More than likely she's been abused in her childhood, right? And so she's acting out. She's gotten in trouble at other schools. And so now I'm thinking this Christian school, right, was probably a school where people send children who have gotten in trouble, right? There's those alternative type schools, or a private school where they'll get more attention, right? So she's already in this vulnerable state. She already feels shame, probably from abuse, and also because she has actually done some things to get in trouble. And so he's able to use that to shame her into doing what he's telling her to do. And then here's the kicker. The girl's mother, who witnessed the incident, she was there during this. And these are real stories, you guys. We got to remember, this is, a counselor telling stories. So the mother was there witnessing the incident, and she told police she was too frightened to stop the headmaster. So I'm thinking more than likely mom was being abused too, and so she was too scared to speak up. In fact, the mother was so intimidated that in the middle of this incident, she told her daughter, just do whatever it takes so we can get out of here. The principal was given a 1-year prison sentence for abusing this girl and another young boy. In the process of prosecution, it was discovered that this man had been kicked out of another school district in another state for what appeared to be physically and abusive behavior. Shortly after the principal was released from prison, he moved to Europe, and he quickly started another private school. And that is the only things he gives us on, like, red flags, how to tell if somebody is possibly an abuser. The intimidation thing made me think about, like, I was thinking about this, I think most of us, probably all of us, have probably experienced abuse to a point, right? Even if it's just a quick passing thing, there's abuse. We have abusive tendencies, a lot of us. So when does it turn into abuse, right? Like, one example is like I used to work with donations. There were certain things I kept in stock for families, and that's all I kept in stock because that's all the space I had. And donors would call, right? And so some donors would call, they would have an item that they wanted to give me, but I didn't keep that in stock and nobody needed it within the program. So I would decline, the best way I could. I would give them other options of where to take it. And some of them would be like, they would throw into the conversation, oh, well, I happen to know the CEO, right, of the place I was with. And it wasn't like, oh, I know the CEO, you should take this. It was more of like a conversation we were having, and they slipped in, oh, I know so-and-so. We've, actually, spent some time together and stuff. And I'm like, okay, they're trying to intimidate me because they're saying, well, I know the leader of your organization, so you should take. I know what they were doing, right? Is that abuse? Were they abusing me? I guess that depends on if that's what they do on a regular basis, right? So if you operate in that way, trying to intimidate people on a regular basis, yes, I would consider that abuse. Now, if that happened, like I happened to do that to somebody, and then I'm like, ooh, I noticed I did that and I stopped, like, is that considered abuse? Did I abuse that person? You know what I mean? So I think we have abusive tendencies. We may act on these lines, right? And it really, I think, depends on then, do you operate on a regular like this for it to actually be, you're considered an abuser. There's also the whole, I had experienced one of the higher ups wanted me to do something that I did not agree with doing. And it wasn't anything bad, but it was just something I didn't feel was healthy or the best thing for the clients. And so she started throwing titles around because I was standing up and I was like, no, I don't agree with this. And I'm the one who would actually have to implement this. So no, I don't agree and I won't be able to do that. And so she started to try to intimidate me by throwing around names and titles. And I kept my ground. I was like, no, not doing it. And that's only because I'm in a healthy spot now. Now, if it was me 10 years ago, I would have totally done what she said. She wouldn't have even needed to bring up names, right? So that's another benefit of us healing and being confident, is that we can, in proper ways, stand our ground and say, no, I can't comply with that. And these are the reasons why. And there's nothing they can do to make you change that, right? Where are we at? All right, 9:14. If a person's still in here who is trying to get on as a guest, I just want you to know, like, I'd rather know the people ahead of time who want to come on, because I have allowed people to come on before and it turned out not to be a good situation, so I don't want to do that anymore. So if you do want to be a guest because you had something you wanted to talk about that has to do with this, and we can have a discussion, that's great, but reach out to me afterwards and we can set up, that opportunity. Because I would like, I would like guests up here. I would like you talking about your, your situations. If you have anything to add to this, if you have questions. But again, I want to know what it's about ahead of time. Okay, so we're done with that piece of red flags. And then he goes into types of abusers again. Which, like I said, I feel like we already went through that, but it's kind of different. So, like, he has general adult child molesters. So there's, like, child molesters, right? And he does focus on sexual a lot. So I'm thinking that is the most dominant thing that he has had in clients coming through his office. Then there's fixated child molesters, which we call pedophiles. Then there's female molesters. Then there's adolescent molesters. And then there's children who violate other children. And then he talks about physically abusive men. And then that's the end of this chapter. So I think I'm just going to go through some of this for each piece, not necessarily read every part of it. Okay, so types of abusers. In addition to these general characteristics, it's helpful to note specific characteristics of several types of abusers. Entire books are written on single types. That's true. Like if you need one, you know, if physical abuse was the main thing you went through, you can definitely find books. You can do research on that. If, you know, mine, I'd say most dominant was probably mental emotional abuse. So that is what I heavily focused on in my healing. So you have to figure out what is your focus, you know, and then you can hone in on that. All right, so general adult child molesters come from all walks of life. They're very difficult to identify even for professionals. The only observable distinctive of adult child molesters is that they are overwhelmingly male, 80 to 90%. I think that a lot of female stuff is not reported. I do know people where their mom was the one who sexually abused them and it never was reported. It's the same thing with like any abuse in general, right? A lot of it, it's focused on men. Because women report more often than a man's going to report, right? Because there's, I think, an extra shame that people feel when they're a man and they're reporting being abused. So I think a lot of this is underreported with women. The influences that lead a person to sexually violate a child or adolescent are complex and not entirely understood. For example, it may be a misconception that the majority of child molesters were abused as children. Some current research indicates that 20 to 35% of child molesters were themselves sexually abused as children. While this figure is certainly much higher than the rate of abuse experienced in the general male population, it shows there must be other factors besides personal sexual victimization. We know that the high percentage of child molesters report they came from dysfunctional families of origin. So there wasn't necessarily any actual sexual abuse going on, but the family was very dysfunctional. The majority of sex offenders describe their fathers as cold, distant, hostile, and aggressive. Often report conflicted relationships with their mothers, experience high rates of physical abuse. And again, abuse is power and control, right? So if you are raised in a childhood where there's a lot of physical abuse going on towards you, I could definitely see like that power and control. You want that power and control because you know, you had that taken from you, right? As you were being physically abused, you had no control or power in that situation. So you want to flip that and you want power and control. Whatever way that comes out in your life is, you know, based on you, but you want that power and control. And indicate that they communicated less with their parents than did their peers. Recent research suggests that witnessing serious intrafamilial violence and experiencing neglect may be more influential than sexual abuse. So witnessing the abuse and experiencing neglect, they're saying through studies, is actually even more influential and harmful than sexual abuse. That's something to think about, because I mean, sexual stuff is, it's pretty traumatizing because of the way God created us and why he created sex and the ties and the bonds and all that comes from that. So for them to say in studies that, neglect and witnessing is even more harmful is something to think about, I guess. Something that's grabbing my attention. Thus, the families may... Okay, I don't think I'm reading this wrong. I think he he didn't write it well. Let's see. Thus, the families many adult molesters come from. Okay, all right, that helps. Thus, the families many adult molesters come from are emotionally and physically hurtful. They do not provide healthy emotional nurturing, respect for the individual, and modeling of healthy conflict resolution and communication skills. So I guess, I could see that. These negative relational experiences lead some men to distrust adult relationships and to look to children or adolescents to meet their needs. And then he gives characteristics of what they categorize as adult child molesters. They most often molest females. They're rarely family members of the victim. When the molester is a family member, he is more likely to molest the children repeatedly and more severely. Step parents are up to 10 times more likely to molest than natural parents. Child molesters often have large numbers of victims. In one study, the molesters of girls had an average of 20 victims, while the molesters of boys had an average of 150 victims. Child molesters are rarely caught and thus may have no criminal record for molesting. I know in my situations with the men that had abused me sexually, not one of them was reported. So I definitely do believe that is definitely something that's not reported on a regular, especially when it's something like one of them was, he pinned me against the wall and kissed me, like, made out with me. I guess, especially way back then when that happened, right? Is that something you go to the police for? Now, yeah, I would. I would totally go to the police for that. But, I think a lot of that stuff, it's like, oh, well, that wasn't really a big deal, Let's just forget about it. It's fine. You'll be fine. Just don't go around that person anymore, right? I think that's the mentality based on how severe you believe something is. All right, so they are, however, often guilty of committing non-sexual crimes and may have a criminal record for some of these offenses, which may indicate they are a potential sexual risk to minors. So then there's the fixated child molesters, which we call pedophiles. Some child molesters are so consistently sexually aroused by minors that they are placed in a separate category that we call pedophiles. These people are often called fixated molesters for their sexual fixation with children and adolescents. Most often their attraction is to boys. They will typically have a fairly narrow age range. Through self-assessment surveys and personality tests, pedophiles are often shown to be introverted, emotionally immature, and fearful of adult relationships. Thus, they turn to children for intimate relationships because they relate to them much better. This helps us understand why they actually often believe that they're expressing love to the children that they are abusing. They tend to use physical force less frequently. They often utilize threats and psychological manipulation to keep their victims silent about the abuse. Pedophiles are often extremely deliberate, patiently grooming potential victims in order to gain their trust and lower their inhibitions. Then there's female molesters. While female molesters are far less common than male, many experts believe that the number of female perpetrators is significantly underestimated, and that females may be responsible for as much as 20% of the sexual molestation of minors. There is limited literature on female offenders, but this woman, Anna Salter, noted that given what we do know, we can place female molesters in 3 categories. Women who molest children under the age of 6, usually their own children. This is one of the largest groups of female offenders. These are women whose identities are so amalgamated with their children's that they cannot function as mothers. So amalgamated is combined or united with their children, that they cannot function as mothers. Rather than nurturing children as healthy mothers do, they use children to meet their own emotional and sexual needs. Tragically, these women often have sadistic tendencies and take twisted pleasure in hurting children. The teacher-lover group of women is the next group, who primarily takes advantage of adolescents. They are generally emotionally needy women in their 30s who take advantage of their position of authority to build romantic relationships with vulnerable teens. And then the next group, women who were at least initially coerced into having relations with children by an adult male partner. So I can think of like, who's the guy that had the island? His name is not, but you know who I'm talking about, right? And then there was that female who was kind of like his sidekick, his helper. Initially, she was brought in by him. Yes, thank you, Epstein. He lured whoever the female was, I can't remember her name either, but he lured her in through abuse, right? And then, so she would be in this category, right? That he pulled her into this and then, you know, brought in other people, and then she got wrapped up in that. All right, so then adolescent molesters is the next section. Adolescent offenders provide a very serious challenge. It's estimated that adolescents commit up to half of all child sexual abuse. So these are actually adolescent aged molesters, right? And their victims tend to be younger children. They can be put into several different categories. Experimenters. So that's like, it says these youths are typically naive sexually, 11 to 14 years old, who have little history of acting out, and who have a limited number of exploratory acts with children. Then there's the group offenders. These adolescents with little or no previous delinquency history are influenced by peers or engage in sexual offenses against children. Then under socialized offenders, these exhibit chronic social isolation and lack of social skills. They are motivated to molest children by a need for greater self-importance and intimacy. See, all of this is unhealed trauma, right? That's why we're doing this. We don't want unhealed trauma. This is stuff that stems from going down that road. Sexually aggressive offenders, these are adolescents, typically come from an abusive or out of control home and have a personal history of antisocial behavior, substance abuse, and poor impulse control. They often use force. So while there is a broad range of adolescent offenders, research reveals some common traits of adolescents who do this. They tend to come from families that are rigid and emotionally disengaged. They often commit these acts against girls. Compared to non-offending peers, they tend to possess weak social skills, to have learning disabilities, and be more socially isolated and have a sense of powerlessness. The vast majority of adolescents who molest children are males, but the females who do molest children have most often experienced severe maltreatment during childhood, including sexual victimization. Typically, they will molest boys. Then there's children who violate other children. Tragically, children are at risk of victimization not only from adults but also and adolescents. It is not uncommon for children to sexually violate other children. Children who sexually violate other children have often been sexually abused or have been sexualized through exposure to sexual activity. While many, if not most, children at one time or another engage in innocent sexual exploration, playing doctor. I played doctor. I remember playing doctor. So while many, if not most, children at one time or another engage in playing doctor, sexual behavior becomes exploitive if it occurs with intimidation and force, continues in secrecy after caregivers have advised the children that it's not appropriate, involves children of widely varying ages of developmental stages, and involves explicit sexual acts. Unlike adult and juvenile offenders, gender is not a distinctive characteristic of children who do this. In fact, 65% of preschool children who sexually violate other children are girls, though the most sexually aggressive children are males. Then, physically abusive men. While physically abusive men are found in all ethnic and socioeconomic groups, the lowest income households experience dramatically higher rates of male physical abuse. According to the CDC, men who physically abuse their wives have a 50% probability of abusing their children as well. And the most violent wife batterers have almost 100% probability of physically abusing their male children. One of the most predictable features of physically abusive men is that they experienced family violence during childhood. They were taught that physical violence is an acceptable way to deal with stress and frustration. They weren't taught the practical skills of healthy communication and conflict resolution. Behaviorally, the most characteristic pattern of physically abusive men is control. Abusive men have a pathological need to control much or all of their spouses' and children's lives, and they do so not just through physical force, but also through psychological and verbal manipulation and abuse. They often have an underlying sense of insecurity, inadequacy, and powerlessness that results in their need to control family members. So that just made me think of, so they often have underlying sense of insecurity. So they have insecurity, inadequacy, and powerlessness, right? Because they have been through abuse. So yes, you will naturally feel powerlessness when you're abused, right? And so that again makes us want to have that control, because we want to take control because we didn't have any control over what happened to us. But because of how they have unhealed trauma, they're acting out of those feelings, right? They're acting out of that wounding. So instead of acting out of that wounding, because then that becomes abuse and you become the abuser, we want to heal that so that we can have healthy relations and not have to control every person that's around us. So yeah, acting out of that, and that's why we say, like, don't act out of your emotions, right? We want to have self-control. God tells us, like, that's one of the fruits of the Spirit that we want Him to help us increase in, is self-control. So that when we are in these moments of maybe high emotional intensity because of something from the past, we don't act out of that. So like, say I'm being triggered, I'm feeling anxious, and my daughter is around and she says something and I attack her. It's not because she said something that I should have attacked over. It's because I'm already experiencing stuff in here, right? So we want to deal with that so we're not inflicting pain on those around us who don't deserve it, right? So they resort to violence when family members do things that threaten their fragile self-concepts. While there are widely varying types of physically abusive men, the following attitudes and beliefs are characteristic to physically abusive men. Overarching sense of entitlement. So physically abusive men use this sense of entitlement to justify physical violence toward family members who do not give them what they think they deserve. Family members exist to meet their needs. Selfishness, self-centeredness. Their needs are of primary importance within that household, right? Their needs are the most important needs because they never had those needs met, so they want you to meet them. Air of superiority. They believe they are superior to their wives and children. Often this is connected with a global belief in male superiority. And then extreme possessiveness. Family members are viewed as owned objects, which helps explain why physical assault and homicide rates go up dramatically when women separate from their husbands or boyfriends. So I would say, because the people that physically abuse, okay, he's saying men, because they cannot build intimate relationships, truly intimate relationships, because of how they were hurt, right? So we put that wall up, right? We're scared to get close to people, to be vulnerable. And that's what you want in a marriage, is to be vulnerable with one another, right? That's becoming one flesh and not, and being naked. That's being vulnerable. You cannot have that when you have a wall up because of past abuse you experienced, right? So because of that, it seems then you can view other people as objects versus what you really are, right? That's crazy. That's like, whoa, right? To think about. And Again, it's not because of you, because of something you did. It's past trauma that they're still carrying, right? And they're just trying to survive. But unfortunately, when we experience these things, we take on shame. We take on the message that we're the reason why that happened, you know? And it's not. And that's why it's good to read things like this and think about them, because you don't want to take on stuff that's not yours. So now that we've had an overview of the characteristics of abusers, I'm ready to put this information into a relational context in the next chapter. Abusers rarely act in isolation from other family members, right? That's true. In fact, there are notable characteristics of abusive families that can help us better understand the nature and impact of abuse, and we will explore that in the next chapter. So like he said, you know, it's not always like, say somebody sexually abuses somebody, it's not always that it's because they were abused in that way, but just because the family is so dang dysfunctional, right? And so yes, we don't want dysfunctional families, right? And it is definitely in my family dynamic down the generations. As I've looked down the generations, there have always been other people within the household enabling and feeding the abuser, right? Neglect, right, is another form of abuse. If you just stand by and watch things happen, you're neglecting and you're helping actually that a person to continue doing what they're doing by not speaking up. So yeah, so actually this next chapter is, I like so far of what I've read of it. I really like it. He uses a lot of biblical text with David. When I was reading all this stuff about David, because I'm like, yeah, you know, we all know, like, oh, David, you know, he committed adultery and he did all these things, yet God says he's a man after his own heart, right? Like, he just loved David so much. And as I'm reading this stuff, especially, I did not notice this family dynamic in the scriptures I've read and stuff. So when he lays it out in this book, I'm like horrified by David. And I was like, David, my gosh, like, what were you doing, you know? And then I'm like, God, this kind of makes me a little bit like sick. Like, how could you say you loved him so much when he did some horrible things? And it came to mind because David, yes, he did horrible things, but he was truly sorry for it afterwards, right? And we can see throughout the book of Psalms, there's so many times he's on his knees begging God for forgiveness. He is from his heart, God, I have sinned against you. I have hurt this person, right? And he's like, don't have mercy on me and help me, right, to not repeat this. So he had a true heart of confession, agreement, and repentance. And that is why God loved him so much. So that shows us, it gives us hope, right? That no matter what we've done, that he doesn't sit there. God does not sit there and fixate on the things that you've done that are against him or harmed other people or even ourselves. What he wants to see is a genuine heart change, that you understand that this is not the way to live. This is not what you should be doing. And when he sees that, you know, we receive forgiveness and we receive his help and his love in changing it. And so, yeah, so I kind of had that fight within me as I was reading this. I was like, but I'm okay now. So yeah, we'll see. It'll be interesting to go through this next chapter and see how all this unfolds. So I don't know, these kinds, like today, these parts of the book, I kind of like feel like it's just a bunch of statistics and it's, throwing all this stuff out, and it's kind of boring to me, especially because I've already, researched this stuff for so long and whatnot. So I don't necessarily enjoy these parts of the book, but I really enjoy the ones like the next one we're going into, where he actually has stories to it of scripture, and we can, put all that together. So tomorrow should be, at least for me, a bit more interesting, and maybe we can get a little deeper, not just go over the surface statistics, right? So you guys still hanging in there? Learning lots of stuff? Oh, if you didn't know, that's where I'm going to end for today. I'm not going to go into the next chapter. But the next chapter is Portrait of an Abusive Family. Oh, sorry. My messages aren't. Did you find it good? Good. Good. Because, yeah. Good. It makes you kind of scared, right? Like, oh my gosh, literally anybody can be an abuser. Don't let the children out of the home, right? But you also want them to be socialized and have engagement. So, yeah, it's hard stuff to navigate these days. Especially because you can't peg somebody right away unless they're outright just an abusive person and proud of it. Can't necessarily peg them right away, so we got to get to know people. And then become courageous enough to pull out, right? Pull away if we need to. But it's good to know all this stuff, even though it's not the most exciting thing to go through statistics and whatnot. It's good to have that background, in our minds, to be able to refer back to that. All right. So I think today's a wrap. I'm going to go out, do some errands, and go out with a friend for dinner tonight. I think today would be a good day. All right, so I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you in the morning. All right? I will see you guys later. Bye.